Welcome to another smashing edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, I really do need you to support this Rebel transmission. The best way to do that, become a paid subscriber on my Substack. $5 a month, $50 a year. You can also buy me a coffee or send reinforcements through my donor box. Today, we're joined by David Murrin, he's got a super long and amazing bio you can read at davidmurrin.co.uk. That's David, Murrin.co.uk. He's a global forecaster, author, speaker, commentator, advisor on national security, military history, geopolitics, and financial markets. He's got an affordable subscription service as well with his analysis and commentary you might be interested in. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on board in such learned company.
Yes. Well, I think you beat me, but I love the synergy. I wanted to mention this. You actually sent me a message recently about coming on the podcast, but the funniest thing is, for the longest time, I've had your name on my list of guests to get on. I've been following your work for a while, and so it's great. Finally, we get to speak, and maybe to start, I like to bring smart people on who come from all over the place with unique views, and I want my listeners to learn from you, and perhaps you could, to start, tell us about the gist, sort of the focus, the arc of your work, and how you sort of big picture analyze the world, and then we can get into what's happening on the planet.
So to give you a bit of background, I'm a physicist by training, which sort of explains why I try to look at social human dynamics and boil them down to essential behavioral patterns. And I did that because I joined the world of finance, and I was an asset manager and sought to understand what would come next in the macro world, until 9/11 came along, when there was a conjunction between my profession, which was finance, and my passion, which was military history. And I asked a simple question, was that an accident, or was it a far more significant event that would produce a historical outcome that people didn't expect, i.e. not 100 years of democracy, but actually the decline of the American empire? And in asking the question, I then had to work out how to answer it. And there wasn't enough price data to apply my models. So I reverse engineered what I think is a fractal of human behavior in price into what I call the 5 stages of empire. 5 distinct organizational stages, but which I called regionalization, expansion to empire, maturity, overextension, and decline. And by the middle of 2002, I'd managed to go and prove that I could use the clocks of war to describe that pattern in every empire civilization I could come across. And it was profound. It talked about the way that society operated. For example, it expanded in what I call with lateral adaptive behavior, and it can decline with linear, like rigid behavior. And there's a whole thing we can talk about where we are in the world now, which is uber linear, and what that really means for lack of adaptation. But from that simple model, I had to answer other questions: is why was the duration, for example, of Western Christian empires shortened compared to the older systems I looked at? And then I realized that the national systems of Portugal, Spain, France, Britain, Germany trying twice, and America were essentially a bigger system, a super empire, which was a Christian mimic empire, starting with the Catholic faith, with the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Spanish and the French, and then really expanding to the world as a global maritime system, which was based on Protestant free belief, and also the lateralism that was conveyed by high ratio of coastlines to internal volume of Britain and Holland as seafaring nations. And that's really changed the world, because the democracy that started all those years ago in Athens, or attempted to start, or not a version we'd recognize, followed through to the democracies of Protestant countries like Britain and Holland, and they spread to the world. And we've got this ongoing conflict between autocracy and democracy in today's age. Then the other part of this sort of concept was, if there was a super empire in the West, there's probably one somewhere else. And I defined a super Asian empire, starting with the Japanese, followed by the Chinese, and followed by India. Now, that's all very obvious now, but back in 2002, people laughed when I said the West is going to decline, create a vacuum, and China's going to rush into it faster than we can imagine. It's going to out-innovate us, and it's going to lead to a conflict that starts somewhere in 2022 and into the peak of 2030, which is World War III. Now, that was 20 years ago. Now, the idea that you could understand cycles in this particular way, only a few people I've seen have attempted to do it, and this is much more profound in its construct. because it entered another idea, and that was the work of Kondratiev. And Kondratiev was a Russian economist. He believed in 56-year cycles, which is 3 kind of lunar peak cycles, in effect. That's probably where it comes from. And every time it peaked, or the world peaked, he noted there was conflict. Now, that really got my interest as someone interested in military history, because suddenly military history and finance coincided. And I worked out that the beginning of the last Kondratiev cycle started in '02, the one we're in, and I made a lot of money by being long of resources into the 210 peak. But I also realized rather soberingly that meant there would be a war at the end of it. And that war would be the drumbeat, in effect, of the shift of power between America and China. Now, all of this was worked out in '02, a long time ago. And since then, I've written books, I've talked about it, and every part of this journey has tracked it. I don't believe in predeterminism, but I do believe in unconscious cycles and collective unconscious cycles. And so the theory of empires, the theory of this Kondratiev surge, which I now would define in the context of something much bigger, and probably we need to talk about that in a second, and it's called entropy, and how humans develop anti-entropy to survive. But we can talk about that when you get a question in.
Yeah, and what you just discussed is fascinating, because that's sort of been the core of Geopolitics and Empire, the podcast. I've had people on, like the late Johan Galtung, who just passed at the age of 93. He was known for, in 1980, he supposedly said that the Soviet Union would collapse in 1990, which it did. He said that the U.S. empire will collapse. First, he said 2020. He revised it to 2025, and so it's kind of like we're along that path. And just on these cycles, I've got a lot of the books behind me, but you talk about the Kondratiev. There's I've looked at all these different other theorists, the Elliott wave, fourth turning. I can't even remember them, all of them right now. But just any thoughts on some of the similarities or differences that you take from these different authors?
So I've been using Elliott wave to analyze markets on a fractal basis since I started this almost 40 years ago. It's a very profound system that, as a physicist, emulates the fractal nature of the universe. It's hard for people to operate because it's visual and it's about pattern recognition. So it's very much for lateral thinking people who are sort of visually creative to work with. But it really is the best system I've come up with that shows just how options and permutations work in a quantum mechanical universe, which we now understand us to live in. So Elliott wave is one thing, but with it and with a wave structure becomes a certain emotional cycle. Now, in fact, when you look at a Kondratiev cycle, which is the biggest cycle that I can observe or find, actually, the biggest cycle is 2 Kondratiev cycles. We'll come on to that in a minute. But within a Kondratiev cycle, there is an A wave and a B wave and a C wave, which conforms to wave counting. And so that process basically is consistent, that the fractals of behavior between one and the other are the same. So we see them in K waves, we see them in Elliott waves, and we see them all the way across our human system, in my opinion. And the basis of my 5 stages of empire is linked to Elliott waves work, which is the principal surges of wave 1, 2, and 5. Wave 1, 3, and 5, and the corrections of wave A and C. So it takes the corrections out. And that was the premise that I translated market wave counting structures into empire models and the basis of it, which has performed incredibly well in terms of predicting our behavior and the internal social construct that we would live through in those transitions.
And so, again, you're the expert here. And one of my points, as well as for my interviews, is sort of to get across, my guests to get across what's most pertinent on their mind. So you mentioned entropy, if you want to talk about that.
Well, so one of the things, as a physicist that looks at primary constructs, is I had identified how we organized, but I didn't understand really why. I mean, there was a linkage to expanding populations for self-organization, but fundamentally, we self-organize into these structures. If you take away the destructive elements of maybe 1 or 2% of human populations, we are collectively anti-entropic. We work towards creating productive outcomes that push back the entropy of the universe. Because put quite simply, anything that lives in an entropic universe has to do that to survive and create a bubble around it. Because if you just stood still, you'd rot where you stood, just like a building covered with ivy and microbes 100 years later, we would be the same. So living is an act of will and energetic process, and that creates anti-entropy. And humans came up with this idea that we'd do it socially, collectively, and so the entropy of 1 is less than the entropy of 2, and the entropy of 10 is more than 2 by a factor of more than just the numbers. I would call it social coherence. And empires are really on the upward facing slope, the expansive dynamics of collective human anti-entropy that's coherent. And of course, it reaches a peak, and then entropy starts to take hold of the system, and gradually, unbeknown to the system, it starts to decline. So this entropic process is the fundamental reason why we do what we do, why we socially organize to create empires, and those empires basically anti-entropic. That's our survival mechanism. But coming with it is a really hard realization. Is imagine an empire that's gone up and it's curved, and it could just occupy the space in like an old person that doesn't live and doesn't die. And that doesn't really suit the collective organism called humanity. And so what happens is another system rises into the vacuum, as I described the Asian system. But the drumbeat that dictates the time at which the challenge turns to conflict, now that is all about the Kondratiev cycle. So there is like a drumbeat and a rhythm to war. And that rhythm's biggest cycle is 112 years, which is between great hegemonic conflicts like the Spanish being challenged by the French, like the French being challenged by the British, like the British being challenged by the Germans in 1914. And sometimes once the trigger point is reached, the cycle may peak, but it still carries on for another 30 years. So although the best way to think of a Kondratiev cycle is a surge of entropy. Unconsciously, it's like a pulse which goes through the human collective and triggers and jiggles connections, which means that we move to challenge at that moment. So the biggest cycle I can identify is 112 years. Every 56 years, you get the smaller conflicts like the Cold War, Vietnam, or the American Civil War, or the 7 Years' War. But the big ones, which decide how the larger collective is governed, they come every 112 years. And at the basis of that challenge is something quite fascinating. Is originally humanity was a hierarchical system, but essentially, thanks to maritime adapted processes, and going to sea makes you adaptive and it makes you lateral, or it self-selects to be lateral. So the ratio of coastline to internal volume will dictate how many lateral and linear people there are in a population. And it's no coincidence that Athens was a sea power and it attempted the early forms of democracy, and Britain and Holland were both sea powers, or they were maritime powers before they were sea powers, and because they were full of lateralized people that lived by the sea, who were self-responsible because they'd gone out in their boats, separate from everyone else, and that self-responsibility was something that was actually, biased towards democracy and give me control over my life rather than being told what to do. Whereas land powers remained hierarchical. And that is a fascinating distinction. And so the big struggles in hierarchical power are all about democracy versus hierarchy. You can go back and look at Napoleon as being more dictatorial than the kings around. I know it sounds funny to us today, but he was seen to be that dictator. And you can see how the Kaiser was more dictatorial than the other European powers. I mean, certainly the second form of Hitler was more than. And this great struggle we're in now is the human race going to be hierarchical under the vision of the CCP, or is it going to maintain its individual democracy? And the struggle is coming at the time when democracy is weaker than it's probably ever been in its history since it started. So this isn't really a good test. It's a more vibrant hierarchical system in China versus an older and decrepit version of democracy in the super Western Christian empire in the terminal phases of this last cycle. And I think what we're looking at is the need to reinvent ourselves, to reaffirm what our new form of democracy is. And we're not going to do that voluntarily. We're going to be forced to do it in the fire of conflict.
It's interesting you mentioned 112 years. I've been instinctively calling the situation that we're in the 100-year storm. For the past 10 plus years, when I was teaching previously, I would be telling students, we're in sort of like a 1920s, 1930s moment, and then things just seem to be lining up again. And then if you want to tell us sort of where we are and where we might be going, I've been focusing a lot for the past 20 years. I decided to permanently expatriate from the U.S. Empire, and I've been fascinated by the decline because in my view, again, looking at history, you see as we decline, the economy deteriorates, the culture degenerates, and politically tyranny rises. And I'm proof of that. A U.S. citizen being targeted by our intelligence agencies, taking me off from financial platforms, as I mentioned to you, the HS taking me off of PayPal, and then so you've got Washington, London, EU, NATO, and then you've got this apparent rise of the global South, BRICS, China, Russia, Eurasia, multipolarity. So where are we at?
All right, so let's just look at America. America entered the fifth stage of decline in 9/11. And the stage that recognized it was basically the loss of moral imperative by torture and rendition by the evil duo Rumsfeld and Cheney. That's the beginning of the loss. All empires have a moral belief that they have the right to rule by a form of superiority. And you can see that the Chinese are trying to establish their legacy to rule the world, going back to the Han Chinese in 200 BC, because it's consistent and it runs through the threads, and they are in effect the children of these people. That this is almost 2,200 years ago. Now, I would dispute violently that Chinese consistent empire streams are in fact older than the West. And the reason why I would do so is because if you look at that circle around the Yellow River that their civilization centered upon, and if you compare it to our circle, so the Yellow River is compared to the Nile, and the Egyptians are our river culture, and rivers concentrated populations and allowed sophisticated agrarianism. So the Egyptian culture is the first of the Western cultures. And the Greeks are the second of those cultures, and the Romans are the third. Now, once you think about that, and the advantage we had is once the river concentrated the Egyptian population, we now had seafaring across the Eastern Mediterranean, which was like a massive superhighway to develop these civilizations, something the Chinese didn't have. So it's no surprise that when you take that continuum of our Western empires, Rome was 800 years in advance of any Chinese civilization. At the time, it became a million-strong population in the city. It was 200 BC in the case of Rome, and it was 800 years later in the case of China. It was the same point when Rome could facilitate 2% of its population in a professional army, which was the same thing that happened in China at the same size of city populations of 1 million. I say that because for the Chinese listening, they don't have moral superiority. The continuum of ours is more diverse and richer, and it goes back almost 1,000 years beyond the beginnings of their civilization that we can trace. So that's an important point. But what we're facing right now is we're at the end of an organizational process that took the West to control the world, predominantly through the British Empire and its maritime power. And much as we've thought America is powerful, it is but a fraction of the power that Britain really had. Britain had no challenges from Waterloo all the way through to the First World War. No one could face it. A fleet that could take on any two nations. And yes, we might have had local wars in Crimea, but truly our position as a global dominant hegemon was way beyond anything America experienced through the Cold War, where it was struggling to push back the Soviet Union. I say that for the Americans listening, it's a hard pill. America is an empire. And I know most Americans don't like that. It's a very sophisticated form of empire because it allows the vassal states to think they're free within the Western construct. So it gives freedom to Japan or Germany or even Britain within certain boundaries. And it provides defense alliances that maintain their freedom, their values. And the way it works is it extracts dollar value through a dollar empire. And that dollar is the hidden transmission of wealth. What people don't realize when you're American saying, that's not our war, we shouldn't be going there, the very fact that America is wealthy and the people domestically have enjoyed a very high standard of living is because of the existence of this empire of dollarization, which is defended by the military and peace is maintained within it. And since Obama came along, the shrinkage of that dynamic is very significant. And significant because all empires that are mature live on very narrow margins, and the margin that made it profitable has disappeared. Hence the massive debt surge, which we've been seeing, which is another part of the declining stage. So 9/11 was all about the loss of moral imperative. And then, of course, America happened upon this wonderful idea that they could actually, if their growth decreased for strategic reasons, they could just pop a little leverage, print some money, and if real growth halved, You just double it up with some leverage and it would look the same. Politicians got re-elected. People thought it was really cool. Rates were suppressed because America had this great idea to export all its manufacturing to that very cheap place called China. And the result was suppressed inflation, suppressed interest rates, and mad money printing, which finally came to an end 20 years later. And if it started in '03 with 3 times leverage, we're probably at 40 times leverage now, like a super leveraged bomb. That's basically where America is, thanks to its leadership. Now, one of the problems of money printing, which is just not discussed, is all about understanding that humans are not all the same. We accept that some of us can run 100 meters in under 10 seconds, well, 1 or 2. We accept that some of us can do in 12 seconds or 13 seconds. Those physical attributes we understand, or someone's taller and can dunk a basketball. But what we really don't understand is how different and the diversity of human thought processes. And I would argue there are 2 subsets of humanity. It's genetic. The first subset is the oldest. It's the hunter-gatherer roots, which were highly adaptable for daily survival. And those hunter-gatherers became the warrior leadership clan predominantly. And then the next clan came along, which was through agrarianism 10,000 years ago, which is all about predictability and repeatability. So we have this, all cultures have a duality between being lateral and linear. And what happens is that lateral people are adaptive and they tend to build things. So most empires are built by lateral people, having gone through the first stage of regionalization, having gone through a civil war, which we'll come on to in a minute. Lateral people move out and build the empire. Now, war is and has a massive social purpose for humanity. So until we can substitute the social purpose, we have to assume we're going to keep having wars with the periodicity of the cycles we've talked about and smaller ones below that. And that is essentially, wars mean that rising systems are adaptive and lateral, and old systems tend to be linear, especially if they printed money, because it allows you to pretend it's all going to be the same, to remove maverick thought or maverick questioning, and linear people work together to hold it all together on the railway tracks and refuse to see the tidal wave coming at it because it wasn't part of the plan. And that makes them prey to this adaptable rising system in the conflict. And if there's one thing that happens in conflict, is systems lateralize. Linear leadership gets its men killed very quickly because it's predictable, and lateral leaders rise to the fore, and the longer the war, the more adapted the lateral system becomes, even though many of those people are dying in the process. And the net effect is adaptability, creativity. Look at Ukraine. Look at even the Russians are adapting in the way they fight. And the Ukrainians are more innately adaptable because democracy imposes greater levels of self-responsibility and thought than the Soviet system. But all systems will adapt. It's a question of how fast. So conflicts like a civil war supercharge a country because both sides, everyone's involved in it, and it purges the system of linear thinkers and it surges forward because the lateral people are fully in charge afterwards. They're militarized and they run down all the resource chains. That's where China is, interestingly enough. And the West is very much in a super linear state because of the sophistication of our money printing has made it go on for longer and longer. And the maverick lateral people have been spat out and they're in fields somewhere looking down rabbit holes with not enough linear skills to work out which rabbit hole's real or not. And they're completely bamboozled as a result. So I would argue in this dynamic, it isn't I'm better than you and you're better than me. The mindsets have symbiotic relationships. Strategic thinking is a lateral process, but execution and repetition is a linear process. Well, obviously, I might build a factory, but I'm not going to run it very well. Then a linear person will run it better than a lateral person. So we need to understand our differences and work together, especially at a time like this where we're really under stress. But that's not how our leadership's working. Our leadership is blind right now. In fact, it's got its foot on the accelerator in the case of Biden and certainly Sunak in the UK, and they are driving the world into war by their, in effect, extreme appeasement strategies, which are basically even worse than Chamberlain, because Chamberlain assumed the worst and was preparing with a defensive package, whereas Biden actually hasn't, and he's weakened American defenses, and Sunak has actually given the keys to the door away. So there's some parallels which are quite frightening, both of which are super linear leaders, and both of the people around them are super linear too.
I got so many questions, but let's get to the war thing. So many people I've had on and just me reading the tea leaves, the signals, it just seems like this momentum has been built on this train, and it's almost like it can't be stopped. So many things we can discuss. Many countries now, Croatia, my own country, Serbia, Baltic, European countries they want to bring back conscription. You're seeing, the U.S. empire say South Korea needs to have nukes. They're putting together an Asian NATO. I saw you just on your Twitter share news of stuff like that. So this march towards war, I feel like it's inevitable, because as you say, war is the default in human history, peace is the anomaly. And so your further thoughts on this conflict that's coming, can it be stopped? What might it look like? Will tactical nukes be used? Further thoughts.
So we're over the brink, I'm afraid. And what's important to understand is what's driving this process. I can talk about, a 112-year cycle and the entropy that surges, but there's some also hard things to realize. The Chinese created a brilliant strategy. After the third Taiwan Straits crisis, they realized they weren't going to get through American military power. So they decided to create a process where they induced America to invest in its manufacturing base, to transfer its IP, and what it wouldn't transfer, it would steal in a systematic process of 100,000 plus high IQ Chinese ripping cyberspace apart. And that was happening even as we were trying to transfer manufacturing IP to China, which is just stupid. But you've got to understand the imperative for America was keep inflation low because we need to print money. And that's a weakness that they preyed upon. And there was a blindness across Wall Street of just make money, not understanding we were funding a 30-year plan, which meant that they would take our manufacturing, demanufacture the world, industrialize it, and then they would have the biggest manufacturing capability in the world, as America did in the Second World War, which is how it won the Second World War. So we gave them the keys to our doors. And right now, we've also suffered from really poor leadership, which is typical in American decline. I think Bush was probably, if we could get Bush Jr. back, we'd all yip for joy, and he was relatively strict. He was honest, straightforward, but he was actually, I think, far better than people realize. Obama was the worst president at the time we'd seen. He gave away American power on the most epic scale. And without being racist about it, there is a dynamic in empires where when underclasses proliferate sufficiently to have voting power, their main agenda is social integration, and they fail to understand that maintenance of the borders is critical as well to allow social integration to happen within peace. He neglected all of that, and he gave all the territory away that emboldened the Chinese to start becoming from a covert plan to a more overt plan, which coincided with Xi, who is the most frightening leader we've seen because he doesn't have a chip on one shoulder or the other. He's perfectly balanced. He just has been brought up to believe power is security. And he has a strategic mind that would make most of our leaders, if they can get inside, terrified. And they're running rings around us. So you've got this massive rise of China, this weaponization of China. And the critical to the moment was all challenging hegemons are faced with a hegemony that's had decades to build weapon systems like carriers and naval power. So they don't have the same time. And certainly China doesn't, because it's been held under a glass ceiling for almost 40 years by America. So it's getting the demographic tip over. So it's a real now or never moment for it. And essentially, what they need to do is they seek asymmetric weapons of hegemonic challenge, as I call them. So the Germans use U-boats. They've tried to use an air force. And essentially, what the Chinese created, and when they first appeared, I was screaming, now this is real, was anti-ship ballistic weapons that were conventional warheads to kill carriers, the basis of American power. They appeared in 2017, and I was screaming, guys, this is now really serious. They've created something that's almost impossible to defend against when used in saturation. It destroys American carrier power, and it destroys the basis of hegemonic power projection. Now, you can talk about the US Air Force, but basically carrier power has been it for America. Now, people just didn't respond. I wrote a book about it called Red Lightning, all about how the Chinese are building a system to create Pearl Harbor on steroids, thousands of missiles that saturate Japanese and American defenses in the first hour of a war with no warning, no build-up like we saw in the invasion of Ukraine. And my thesis is that's what they've created. They've basically gone into a 4-year plan since the origins of COVID, which is like a Nazi 4-year plan. They've stockpiling resources. They've got a consumer gap because they've stopped exporting to the same level, and they've militarized their economy, some of which is now directing its output towards Russia at a rate that none of us really could have imagined if you were, rather flighty liberal and didn't understand what we were facing. Entirely predictable. And I mention all of this because the main issue here is China is in a position to truly challenge America. And it has a number of allies. It has Russia, which is, not insignificant, but I do not believe Putin would have gone into Ukraine if he was on his own and China didn't exist. He couldn't have done it. So China was a facilitator. And I'm sure the conversation between Xi and Putin, Xi egged him on to do it, knowing full well he was going to watch what happened, but he egged him to do it and said, of course, we'll support you. Similarly, Iran is another oil-producing commodity relationship. And what China seeks there is, as a commodity consumer, is autocratic powers that will funnel resources in. So one of the fundamental errors in the White House was the belief that economic sanctions were going to hold Putin back. Well, in an upward-facing commodity cycle, the commodity countries like Russia become incredibly wealthy because everyone needs their resource. In fact, you can model the whole Cold War from 1950 to the peak of 75 as one contractive cycle, which enormously benefited Russia. And then, of course, the loss of Russian power when the reverse happened. And in America, they faced 15% inflation, 15% 10-year rates, 22% Fed funds. And America was a vibrant empire, I would say, at the height of its power. And it nearly buckled under that pressure. So right now, you've got a rejuvenation, and you can track Putin's history on this particular contractive cycle. He arrived at the beginning, and you can see as the cycle research, he didn't need the EU anymore from 2008 onwards, and he's used the coffers that were filled by oil exports and gas exports, and he used it to militarize his economy. And although he has poor demographics, as a dictator, he marshaled his whole country into this war. It's one man's war, not a country's war. Whereas China is an expansive system that if you remove Xi, they'd still be there. Whereas if you had a different Navalny, for example, Russia wouldn't have been aggressive. It wasn't innately aggressive. It was aggressive because it is led by an aggressive leader, and it had the resources through commodities. And then the last piece is North Korea, which is not an independent state, but a puppet of China. Every time it throws a rock at America, it's because it was told to by Beijing. We should be treating it as the same country, not as some independent nation that happens to share China's views. On the contrary, and the technology they're developing in their missiles, where does that come from? Well, they didn't develop it. It comes via train from the north. So we've got to see this architecture of what is now a very coherent and integrated autocracy. It's an axis of autocracy that seeks nothing less than the global destruction of democracy. And we are mobilizing so slowly and just do not realize the magnitude of what we face because we're hubristic.
So, yeah, I think that's definitely on point. And I guess beyond the pale, I mean, we can't really predict what would happen, but I guess just one more thought on that. It would be, I mean, tens of millions of people could be.
Look, so you asked about where we are in this process. Make no mistake about it. We can definitely say World War III started with the invasion of Ukraine. And now the Middle East is on fire. That is not a battle between Hamas and Israel. That is a battle between Iran and Israel using Hamas as its proxy. I mean, on the day it happened, I warned it would escalate, and it was the beginning. And why did Iran start it at that stage? It started because it didn't have social coherence, had high inflation, which, funny enough, and high debt levels, which are now being paid off by selling oil to China as the price goes up. But basically, they were like Russia was to hold his bandwagon together. He had to go to war. And he was supported by an alliance of people that believed they could do that. And China is exactly the same. The last piece of this puzzle is when China chooses to go to war and takes the whole of the Asian basin like Japan did in the expansion of the Empire of the Sun, except for there will be no warning because the weapon systems they built defy our ability to assess when they're going to be used. The Chinese understand that all of the wars that the West has won have been intelligence-led. That's why they're into quantum cryptology, so they can send safe signals that we won't break. And why we're into quantum computing, because we want to break things. But the Chinese have thought about that. And one of the problems is that hegemonies are highly predictable in their last stages, in their mature stages. take, for example, Hamas. The Iranians taught Hamas not to use electronic signals that would be heard by Mossad or the CIA. They taught them to use hard telephone lines and pieces of paper. So you can assume that the nuclear program inside Iran has very similar operational levels. So I am really concerned that they are at or close to a breakout. And the reason why they are doing what they're doing is to create the space for them to make the breakout over 2, 3, 4 weeks. And I think it was a huge mistake not to strike their nuclear facilities after their battering of missiles that were defended. But we're missing the point. And I think the reason why so many people came together to defend Israel was because they couldn't assess whether there's a nuclear weapon in one of those warheads. So they had to make as close as possible 100% shield work, because one could be the one with a warhead. So I think we're in much more tenuous ground, and Biden's every step actually encourages aggression through showing consistent weakness. It's appalling watching him.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the Third World War having begun in 2022, I've had a number of European intellectuals on the podcast say exactly the same thing, confirming your analysis. And just to go back to the U.S. For a moment, the West, just any thoughts on what this collapse might look like? Thoughts on this decline of democracy, this increase of tyranny in the West. We've seen in Canada, Trudeau, like people protesting many of the measures of the pandemic, having bank accounts frozen. It's happening in Europe to journalists, to their parents who have nothing to do with anything. They're just accounts being shut off, and now free speech is under attack in the West. So you're seeing these signs, and there's talk of second civil war in the United States. We've got these crazy elections coming up. It's almost banana republic sort of stuff. And any thoughts on this?
So you've a lot of things you touched on. They're all part of one process. So decline means less to go around, and naturally systems fracture to try and compete as to how to split those resources or optimize them. So the decline of American politics and Trump's intervention into it. Now, what was interesting, his slogan was perfect: "Make me great again," because Obama's made me less than. But the trouble with Trump is, although he's lateral and some of the things he points out are appropriate, he is compromised by Russia in some way, in a frightening way. Look at his behavior. He's insulted every politician but one man, and that's Putin. There is some definite hold but that Russia has over his behavior. Look at the way he got the Magda Republicans to stop the arms package, which is so significant to the Ukrainians. I'm afraid he is not an agent for the well-being of America. He's certainly an agent for his well-being because he's a narcissist. And in prior times, a narcissist like Trump would be unacceptable in politics. But one of the processes of systems that rise is individuals are ambitious, but they sublimate part of themselves to a collective that's successful, and they're proud of that collective. On the way down, the collective actually becomes less important than self. And so basically and society becomes very selfish, and narcissists start to thrive. So there are more narcissists in control or in power than ever would have been in the rising process, which is why Trump doesn't look like he stands out, because there are many people around. He happens to be a personification of it. But nonetheless, many of the people that might vote him have narcissistic tendencies themselves and don't see it. Now, the trouble is with narcissists, it's the one thing any contact with them will leave you worse off, period. Whatever you think of their advantages, however you think in business you can harness them or gate them or create boundaries around them, they will blow out of them. You turn your back and you'll turn around to see ashes. So Trump will destroy, even if there isn't a war, Trump would destroy democracy. And he tried to. He's a dictator. He's jealous of Putin's power. So we need to understand he is that man. Biden, on the other hand, is equally as bad, although he's not as narcissistic. He is weak. He is a completely failed, hubristic old man that just everything he touches, from Afghanistan's route that then led to Russia, that then led to weak behavior in support of Israel. Every single part of this story is bad news. And although they try and control China's exports to Russia, they really don't look in the mirror to think, what are the signals we're sending Xi? We've been sending weak signals, so why is he ever going to listen to us when we ask? So there's a lack of awareness, lack of strategic planning. Now, interestingly enough, the condition of America and its fracture has a precedent, and that is Britain. In 1911 to 1912, Britain was literally going through a process where it's becoming poorer. There was a rise of liberalism and the need to literally spread the wealth around from the few wealthy people, which is really where Biden is. He's a wealth distributive politician. And there were two governments, and Winston Churchill wrote about the period, and he said, it was quite amazing that we got through it because I thought the army would have to intervene in a civil war. Now, that political construct emboldened the Kaiser, and the Kaiser became more aggressive, looking to go and drive through the fracture. But all it did was then combine the two sides that turned, faced the Kaiser, and happily went to war in 1914. So for those that think America is going to break into civil war, I would argue not before China makes this move and not before China reunites both halves of the house to face a common enemy. So that's really important. We must remember that. I think the process that you talked about of sort of tyranny, as you called it, there is something that happens less in decline, but in decline it can happen. You know, you can think about Nero and characters in Roman history that are destructive. But I think it's something else. I think as this pulse, with this K wave entropic pulse comes along, intrinsically we know that times are no longer peaceful and full of plenty, that hard times are coming. And the migration of leadership is always towards dictatorship. In democracy, it's benevolent dictatorship like Roosevelt and Chamberlain. And obviously in other places, it's more extreme versions of Hitler and Stalin's behavior, or Xi's to be. So this trend we're seeing is actually a trend where as things become more entropic and difficult, naturally we accept and these people rise. And we sort of intrinsically know that being governed by 12 people deciding do we go or do we go left in a war doesn't work. So I think we're seeing the hallmarks of that and the shadows of it. It's less about decline and more about this pulse and surge.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. There's a logic to it. And maybe your thoughts on the economy, you know, the dollar, its status as world reserve. There's talk of de-dollarization. There's talk of hyperinflation of the dollar, financial crash. Well, what's important for you when it comes to
so
economy?
all of the above, really. I mean, de-dollarization has happened. You've looked, the world has bifurcated into the autocratic powers of China, Russia, and its affiliates, gone. And, you know, China's buying gold for a reason because it knows what it's planning and it's not nice. So de-dollarization is a reality. The world is bifurcated, and the current American empire was based on the whole world being dollarized. So you halve it or you knock a third of it off and it's just not going to work. So the dollar is really under threat. But then if you look at the yen, that's under threat because it sits next to China and it's number one target. If you look at Europe, you know, and I think at the moment, we'll come on to the NATO view of Russia because it's a little bit alarming again. They're so hubristic. They never predict anything that comes ahead. And one of the things they're saying is, you know, Ukraine is obviously sapping the strength out of Russia. What they don't realize is the Chinese and the North Koreans, when they finish their job in Asia, are going to send their soldiers to the Eastern Front quicker than we actually can rearm. And so we need to be aware this is a world war. It isn't just a regional set of isolated events anymore. And we need to be prepared for the massive manpower that China and the Asian countries can bring to bear and resources for industrialization. So this idea that don't worry, the Russians won't be up for it for 10 years is another hubristic idea that's madness. So de-dollarization, yes. Inflation, absolutely. Inflation is going to come because resources are going to go up. This is the phase in the Kondratiev cycle, the C wave, where resource constriction comes through conflict. And, you know, things like gold go up to 10,000 and oil reaches 350 by the peak of 2030. It's nasty stuff. So inflation for a money printing Western world is a nightmare. And we are going to have to face it. And I think there's going to be a massive round of debt forgiveness. Somewhere all of the Western debt's going to turn into 100-year debt with a bullet payment somewhere in the future. And all you've got is a piece of paper. Because without it, we're not going to make it. We just can't create a war economy. And I think that's really what's going to happen. Is interesting enough, we've sort of had this non-real, highly fiatized economy, and war will bring us back to reality, real production rates, real manufacturing capabilities. You know, it isn't about handbags anymore. I'm sorry. If it doesn't help us win a war, it's not there. And so, yes, they'll print money in a different way, but no, it's not going to go to the Magnificent Seven's share price. It's going to go to different places. So we need to get our head around that transition, which is happening as we speak.
And any quick thought on, I'm not very keen on cryptocurrency, but, Bitcoin and stuff like that.
Look, the blockchain construct is an analog construct. And someone will get a quantum computer and rip them apart. So this is only a short-term solution. Yes, you can argue that someone might have a quantum blockchain one day, but I haven't seen the evidence of one turning up. So let's assume it's a short-term hedge against the dollar that's independent of things, and it's behaving like a safe haven, a bit like gold. And yes, I think Bitcoin probably will reach 96, and it possibly could surge to 120. But after that, you're out, I'm out, gone. This is a momentary sort of something that works in an environment for a limited period of time, not a long-term solution. The long-term solution to holding value is gold and silver. It always has been.
This is, I've been coming to the same conclusion. I just see too much tulip mania, cult-like behavior with Bitcoin and the cryptos, and then the energy aspect as well. I just don't. What you just laid out, I've had that same feeling. Now, a quick thought on if you looked into globalism or this idea of world government, because that's something I look into as well. And there's people trying to couple together like a global currency. Do you have any thought on, people talk about Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset, and any thoughts on this idea of globalism and forces?
So I mentioned earlier the phenomena where society becomes highly linear and the lateral thinking people are literally like pushed out into the fields and they're exiled, metaphorically. And human beings don't do well on their own, and they go a little bit sort of down the wrong rabbit holes. But lateral thinkers that have been exiled, that don't have very disciplined linear thought, can go down some very bad rabbit holes. And this particular one is one of my top rabbit hole. Because have you ever met Davos Man? Have you ever really seen him in the flesh? And I have. And believe me, he's not able to come up with a construct of world domination. And if he was that smart, his primary goal would be the Chinese are coming, we better do something about it. But he hasn't seen that either. So rest assured, the idea that these suited people are going to consciously take over the world with the construct doesn't exist. They do things in an unconscious way. And linear systems are about mass. So they just keep expanding like an ink blot. It isn't a conscious expansion, it's just an ink blot expansion. What you see for some of the rationale behind, the justification is happening is the ink blot transmission. Very different from the Chinese. They have an incredible strategic plan, have executed it in multi-facets very successfully, and are moving to where they want to be by purpose, collectively, led by individuals with vision. That doesn't exist in the West in any covert form whatsoever. Because we wouldn't be in this mess if it did.
What are some principles? I know people can subscribe to your affordable subscription service, but what can the average person sort of do to hedge against the hard road that's coming?
So the reason I started Global Forecaster was because I had a view that just going off and managing money again in another wasn't going to help anyone, because our society was at risk. So I really felt impelled, as I did when I overcame my dyslexia, to write Breaking the Code of History, to share my findings, which have just really proven so frighteningly powerfully accurate. It scares me how successfully accurate they are. And it's no use holding that stuff. We had to share it. So it's a great privilege to be on the site talking to you today. And basically, I would encourage people to understand this better. That's what Murrinations are about. They're not just, I get out of bed on the right and talk about it. They are the application of social laws and constructs, which are observable and provable by observation, which I outline for free on the site. And then it's the application of those principles to what's going on in the world right now. So it leaves you to be informed. It's a position where all the things are fact. The reason why we fact check badly is because most people don't have an accurate mosaic to compare a fact to. So they just don't understand what's happening, and you don't know whether it's true or not. But you'll find once you adopt this mindset, it's pretty easy to work out which and when and where essentially it's true or not true. And all of Murrinations is about reconstructing the way each of our readers follows the dots. Now, from that position, what do you do? Well, first of all, you understand it better. And the biggest problem we've got is mass collective denial. And the denial that we're going through is consistent with Pax Britannia ending in 1914. No one could quite believe the world could go from 100 years of peace to a war, because we hadn't seen a world war. So let's tick that one off as historically relevant. But the next thing that's happened is that through money printing, we haven't gone to a little bit of linear. with some lateral people left. The linear people have wiped all the lateral thinkers out in government and leadership. So it's so extreme they can't see what's coming and how quickly it's coming. And then there's another massive own goal, is that when you print money and you push your stock market up, the collective dopamine levels in society are so high, as measured by the bellwether stock markets, but that essentially the cortisol response of looking for threats isn't there. So for those three reasons, we face massive denial. And the first thing to do is to realize where we are in the curve and and that's quite scary, but I encourage everyone to look at it, because if we're older, have children and we care about the future. So the process is we've got to realize where we are, and then we can start to do something about it. And believe me, we can. You can always do something about a problem, but you've got to recognize where it is. So I really encourage people to take the red pill, just as they did in the Matrix. And there's a piece on our site about what that journey looks like. And then from that position of reality and understanding, as an individual, we are in a society that's democratic, where I can speak to you, you can speak to your friends, they can speak to their friends. And what I'm fascinated by is how the cascade of knowledge and change works. So we need to believe in that and be a part of it. And then we're playing our part. And if, for those who are listening, you're in power, then you can come and discuss in more detail what that means for your various problems and solutions. But for everyday people, you still have a role, which was be responsible, use our knowledge to learn, and disseminate our knowledge in conversations. That's so important.
Just one more question. You mentioned earlier that we're in this battle between different systems, different ways of seeing the world. Autocracy, more open systems. One more fear that I have relates to what some people call the Chinese style system of this technocracy. These sort of like digital ID cashless systems that are trying to be implemented, which would make it much easier, for any one who commits a thought crime like myself or dissident. They can shut off your bank account, your ability to travel and work. And these systems will require a lot of energy going forward. And we sort of see in the West, our leaders starting to try and implement these types of systems. Do you have any, like the social credit type system? And any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a really important question, actually, because, often people say to me, so, what do you think the Chinese are going to do? And I answer and say, quite simply, the CCP perceives democracy as a virus. It perceives one person who believes they can be free as a source of a whole virus. Look what they did with their viruses to stamp them out. And that's how they see the rest of the world. And their plan is literally to take control of the world. They're already 17% of the world, which is about the same ratio as Germany was of Europe when its goal was to take over Europe. So it isn't, but what's really interesting is they've controlled and dominated their own population. They created a social credit system, which is literally the control of thought and action. They've applied that same system to the Uyghurs, who were hostile, and now they've all been subjugated. They took that same system into Hong Kong, where you had 6 generations of free capitalist Chinese, the most energetic population in the world and productive, and it subjugated them in 3 months flat. Now, that is scary because they genuinely have the tools. And I think that we didn't really talk about the course of this war as I see it. The Chinese can't win a war outright unless we fold. And I doubt whether we will. What they can do is they can push America out of the second island chain, and maybe, if they're lucky, get to the third island chain, which includes Australia. At which stage, they'll do what Japan did, but they'll do it better. They'll consolidate all of the gains in Japan and South Korea into this massive industrialized conglomerate that essentially resources out of Russia. It won't control the blue oceans at that stage. It will send its men to the borders of NATO, and it will consolidate for 5 years, is my guess. And it will come out of that region with thousands of warships to our hundreds. And then it's going to emulate what we did. It's going to use the oceans to surround continents and bring them to their knees. And one by one will go down, and the world will be CCP controlled. That's their plan. Now, there are a couple of things that we are going to get hit very hard when this goes wrong. And so we need to be prepared, and our fragility to know that they can only go so far And then it's up to us to mobilize ourselves to use the oceans that we do control and our industrial base and rebuild it to somehow come up with innovation that, that counters Chinese threats. But at the moment, they could produce 50% more patents than we do, which is exactly what I predicted in a rising system, is they become more creative and they create revolutions in military affairs that overwhelm the opposition. That's our danger. They have the advantage. They've learned everything from us, and now they're innovating beyond us. And hypersonic weapons are a perfect example, or railguns that we failed to follow through in the US Navy in 2021, and the Chinese have now made it work. The warning signs are all there, whether it's cavitating submarines and supercavitation we've just heard about. Like, these guys are on the cutting edge, and we're behind. So we're in trouble, big trouble. And personally, if there's one thing I do believe, I think the future of the human race is about individual potential, is about who we are, our minds, our souls. We are essentially way more than our physical nature, as the quantum mechanical understanding of the universe talks about. And in fact, the implication is our brains are quantum mechanical computers and therefore can influence the world around us. So there is a sort of point at which I've often thought that individual awareness and capability becomes a lot more sort of productive and a force multiplier. And we need to also bear that in mind as we go through the troubles ahead, which are going to be titanic.
We've covered so much mind-blowing analysis and information. The future is not written. That was a great sort of final thought there. Tell us then, the best places we can find you, your projects, services, books, and so forth.
So come to the site, davidmurrin.co.uk. You sign up for free and you can access alerts. So any podcast will come your way. But what we really need to do is access the Murrinations. They're not more than $50 a month, £50 a month. And we're talking about investment grade information of geopolitical understanding that isn't like a newspaper that tells you what's happened. It basically will tell you what will happen before it happens. And then we even track the newspapers catching up with us just to show you how often we're ahead of the curve. For example, we ran a big campaign, which is essentially Britain needs a missile shield 5 months ago, warning that we were totally exposed as the number one NATO that's basically supported Ukraine, like poked everyone around them. We're on the number one hit list of Putin when it goes wrong, and Britain has no missile defense shield. And 5 months later, it's now finally coming to the public. People are finally talking about it. And that's very common, where things we talk about are before others or before people see it. So become informed, understand what's really going on, overcome your fear. And that's it. If you're a financial investor, if you're basically in that space, we have a whole area designed for the senior levels of asset management. And if you're a government agency, we also work with agencies, provide our knowledge to solve problems, whether they're in the military or other areas of government, because all aspects of this model are applicable, whether it's the NHS not working and why it doesn't work. Basically, every aspect of society is touched upon by the broad theories we've talked about, which can be refined into much closer detail, and the principles that are really important to gain growthful, expansive societies that have respectful dynamics.
All right. The links are in the description, so people can go check that out. They can also follow you on Twitter X at Global Forecaster. That's without the last E. Thank you, David, for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time to interview me.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.